Alright, so today we're here with Ron Kasman, the unsung genius of Canadian comics.
You read that?
I did read that.
Okay.
That's what I was doing for the last hour.
Yeah.
So, just want to ask you a couple questions.
Sure.
Here. How did you start drawing, and what led you into comics?
Okay. As for comics, I always had the bug, you might say. I'm 63 years old. When I was a child, it was a mass media. Everybody read comic books. So they'd wander into my home. But I think there was a jump between when I became a comic book reader and a comic book fan. And I can tell you when that was. I was 8 years old. I had the measles. And I had a wonderful aunt. She's passed away, named Annie. And Annie was a news dealer, which is a profession that has evolved or disintegrated. We don't think of news dealers anymore. Annie sold magazines, comic books, newspapers in the coldest weather to people walking down the street. And though she was very, very busy, when I had measles, she came over with a stack of comics. One of those comic books was Avengers #4, which is the Captain America Returns issue. And much of it is the basis for the plot of the first, I suppose Captain America movie, where he's found frozen in the glacier.
Okay.
Is that Captain America or Avengers? I think it's
Captain America, yeah.
Okay. It was a brilliant comic book. It would be as though you were sat down in front of the TV while you had the measles and someone had a Lord of the Rings disc and you watched it. It was one of the greatest comics of its period.
Yeah.
So I read that and I decided I was going to collect the Avengers. And I think at 8 years old, I started becoming somewhat serious with all this.
That's pretty impressive, because from my recollection from when I was 8, I was far less interested in reading than just being outside and going to play.
Well, that's probably mentally healthy, but there's no saying that I was at age 8. So I read comic books, and then when I was about 14 years old, I had never seen my name in print. And comics at that time had a circulation of about 250,000 per issue. I'd liked the idea of 250,000 people seeing my name. So I wrote a letter to the Avengers, because I had a full collection of them. And I remarked upon the variety of people that had been in the Avengers comic. When they published that, which was in Avengers #72, and by the way, I was not the star of the column. The star of the column was Keith Pollard. He sent a letter to Avengers #72 as well. He became the Fantastic Four artist a few years later. Yeah, a lot of people sent letters to those columns. So when it saw print, I got letters from all kinds of people. There were legions of us. How was I supposed to know? So I started becoming a comics fan, and I started imitating the art inside. And as you'd imagine, my first drawings were very, very bad, but most people couldn't draw at all. By the time I was in grade 11, people called me the artist. I would do, bad cartoons with my teacher, and little cartoons to promote things that were happening in the athletics area. And I remember the guidance office had an art contest, so I did a drawing and put it up. Then I started doing some drawings for fanzines. The fanzine circulation would be a couple hundred maybe, but people saw my work all over in these fanzines. It was a big thrill.
One of my first introductions to comics myself was through fanzines, through the comic store in the town I grew up in. And I remember the owner saying to me, well, if you don't like superheroes and stuff, there's these things. And it was these little pamphlets, and they're just like these, some of them were lewd, some of them were really amazing, but the stories were so different compared to reading superheroes. And there's nothing wrong with superheroes, all the power to them and that and everything. When I think you're exploring comics, it's good that you are just have a vast variety of selection, whether it be superheroes or supernatural or something. And I think in a lot of ways that led me away from the Kirby-esque and Stan Lee stuff, and led me more to McFarlane and yourself. and Dave Sim, etc. It's just a very different different style of like writing, creating everything.
When I was, say 14, 15, 16, there wasn't a lot other than superheroes on the stand. They were becoming big. Comics as a whole were shrinking, but Marvel was growing. So a lot of the people who really cared about the Marvel comics and were reading that stuff.
Yep.
A lot of the stuff that I do today is a reaction to my love of Marvel, and I've got a copy here. I don't know how it'll look on the camera, but I'll talk about it. So this is one of the fanzines that I later worked for, and it had a circulation of 27,000. So we're getting up there. We can still call it a fanzine though. And here it is. So by the time my work evolved to the point where it could be published in a magazine like this, it was still about superheroes, and it's called Captain Bill. It's about a store manager who everyone calls Captain Bill. And a man goes to see Captain Bill, and he starts getting his love back of drawing. He's a professional artist, but a lot of professional artists really don't want to draw once they get away from the job. It's downtime, it's relaxed time.
Yeah.
So this is about someone who, because he goes to the comic store and meets this man, Captain Bill, who just loves comics. He regains that love of comics that he once had. So there are no superheroes in it, but you might say it's a bit incestuous because it uses the superhero as a takeoff point. When Cerebus the Aardvark started, it also used the superhero as a takeoff. I mean, Conan the Barbarian wasn't technically a superhero, but he was a big muscular guy saving women and cutting people in half with his broadsword. He wasn't that far away.
That's fair. Besides your own work, what are your favorite comics?
Okay, that's a real tough one. I don't read a lot of comic books today, so the stuff I talk about is historical in nature.
Okay.
And we heard about Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby would be at the tip top of my list of great comic artists. He was the one that affected me deeply as I was growing up. And to take away the personal effect, I think if you analyze what he did for the industry, he did more for the industry than anyone. Some say he did more for his art form than any other artist did for their art form. People whose work we admire, like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, they admire Jack Kirby as well. He was truly a brilliant man. Wally Wood, he peaked a little bit before my time, but I do read the stuff he did from the 1950s. Is his name lost now?
Unfortunately, I cannot directly remember who Wally Wood is.
Wood was good. He was good.
That's the quote of the day. Wood was good.
Again, some people are completely aware of this, others aren't. But in the 1950s, there was a company called called EC.
Fantastic company.
Okay, he was the premier artist at EC. And he's probably best remembered for his science fiction illustration at EC. But everything else that he did was really good, too.
I remember recently I read the mysteries and supernatural from EC Archives, and that unfortunately it doesn't really give much information on like the artists, and that which I feel is insulting in a lot of ways when you have a collected work like that.
Wally Wood, they say that at that time, I would have been born around the time EC was coming out. I have no memory of it, and it lived on as Mad Magazine, so in a certain way it's still around. But they said that there were two main forces in comics at the time. One force was the Alex Toth style, where Alex Toth drew very, very simply, but every line was in the right spot. The other one was the detailed style, as epitomized by Wally Wood, where he put everything into a panel that you could possibly want and excited you that way. So I like Alex Toth too, but it doesn't do a lot for me. I look at it and say, yeah, I understand why he's so good. He's a brilliant man. But I look at Wally Wood and it excites me, and I understand why he's a brilliant man.
Awesome. And what are your current projects?
I don't have one on the go right now.
No?
I'll tell you what else I've got lying around. I've got a sequel to this lying around.
Very
Should
nice.
this get on the New York Times bestseller list, you'll see a sequel. I've got a Canadian superhero lying around. I've got a computer dating story lying around. I've got a story about the Church of Scientology, and if they fall apart, so that I know they won't sue me, I'll do my story about the Church of Scientology. I've got a story about what it's like growing up. I grew up very close to where we are right now.
Okay.
I remember this area when across the road from it was not a Hudson Bay, but a place called Savette City. That's what it was called. My mom and dad would drive to it occasionally, and on occasions of that, I would go with them, visit Savettes. So this was the edge of a Jewish neighborhood when I was a kid. I grew up here, and I've got a story about what it's like growing up in a Jewish neighborhood. I've got another fan story, which is a fictitious view of fandom as it was when I was growing up. This is also a fictitious view, but it's a New York view. The one I have is completely unsaleable, and for that reason, I just can't imagine myself doing it. What else do I have in the file? It's easier to write these things than it is to draw these things. Drawing 216 pages is going to take you a year doing it full time. But writing them, you can put out a script and even lay it out in your spare time, doing a little bit a day. It's hard to do that with the writing. So next might be becoming a better musician. I'm not a good musician at all. My dream in life is to get on an open stage on a Tuesday, do 3 songs and not appear foolish. And that could take me a while to figure out too.
I have actually a suggestion for you
Yes.
after we're done this.
Okay.
There is a open mic night around the corner from where I live, and it is on Tuesdays actually.
Is it Bloor and Brunswick?
It is on Wellesley and Young.
Okay, no, I don't know that one. But I don't think I'm going to go any farther than that, but I'd like to try that.
Awesome.
I've also got a toddler at home. You might not think it to look at me, but I've got 2 grown children and a toddler. So I'm paying a bit more attention to the toddler, and I might pay a whole lot more. What I'm doing right now with this is I'm spending about a year. This came out January 12th.
Okay.
So I said, I'd give it a year. I'll do things like this to try to promote it, see what happens. The chance of me making money on this are slim to nil. But they're not absolutely nil. I'm not looking at this as a money-making project, because spending as much time as I did, even to hit minimum wage, it would be an awful lot of work, an awful lot of promotion. I don't think that's going to happen. But I would like to get it into people's hands. And if after 1 year it hasn't gotten into enough people's hands, I'll say, I tried it long enough. I did my best on it.
Fair enough. What are your current thoughts on the industry right now?
Again, this is not something I'm close to. I understand it's in a state of extreme flux, that the 3rd largest publisher now is Indiegogo and similar fundraising sites. So we're at a point where anybody can get their work published, but I think the problem after publication is distribution. A lot of stories are out there that wouldn't be out there otherwise. It's a good thing that we have this. I'm just not knowledgeable, but what comes to mind is Marvel and DC are publishing fairly uniform products. Superheroes do well, so we're getting a lot of superheroes from them. That's how it seems to me. But you could probably ask an 8-year-old boy that and get a more accurate answer. I find the stuff that they're publishing not to be terribly interesting. Not that it's bad. I've been told by people I respect it's actually quite good. It's just that at what do they cost now? $3.99, $4.99?
It ranges, I believe, from like $2.99.
Oh.
Image has, I think, the lowest price point. Image and DC have the lowest price point right now.
Is that $2.99?
Yeah.
Okay. And I timed myself reading some comics a while ago. I bought the Ultimate Fantastic Four, which
Okay.
I thoroughly enjoyed. That's about year 2000, around there. I enjoyed them very much. But the average one took 11 minutes to read.
Yeah.
And I'm a cheap guy. I don't want to pay $3.99, even $2.99. and read it for 11 minutes and throw it in a pile. I'm just not doing that. So what I find myself doing is getting books on the people. Like right now I'm reading a book on Jack Kasman. Jack Kasman was an EC artist, best known for his, I wouldn't call them love stories, usually about marriage gone wrong stories. He wasn't one of the greats, but he was one of the very goods. So I'm reading 160 pages of Jack Kasman. I'm reading The Collected Lil Abner by Al Cap. I'm reading Mary Worth right now. Some of these things, they're not lost, but they're just better than the stuff. I mean, unless Marvel's printing something that's absolutely brilliant, we're at a time where we can pick and choose from the entire history of comic strips and comic books, and we know in advance what's the best. So I'm not going to the Marvel, the DC, or even much of the indie.
Fair enough. Where is it? With Marvel and DC and that kind of this super expanse that they have with films and everything. Do you feel that we are going to reach a bubble where it's just going to pop like what happened in the tech industry years ago?
Well, again, I'll answer that, but from a point of ignorance. The parallel that I have often read is musicals in the late 50s and early 60s. At one time, musicals were very, very popular. Everyone went to see them. They were wonderful films. I still watch them myself. But then the musicals stopped. They haven't reoccurred. Eventually, that's bound to happen with the superhero films, but no one knows if it's going to happen in the spring of next year, or if it's going to happen in 20 years. People love them. These things are making the third and fourth largest films of all time for gross are the two Avengers films.
Yep.
From my point of view, at this point, everybody is a comic fan. We won. Little guys like me, that 8-year-old kid who was reading that Avengers and decided based on it that he would go out and collect comics, and then as a child was thought to be this kid who should be out playing baseball instead of reading comic books. Well, I won. Everybody's like me now. They're all not reading comic books, but they're all engaged with the same characters that I cared about when I was a child. In my book, it's about a time when there were only 500 people that would go to a comic convention. The largest comic convention in the world. It was called the New York Comic Art Convention. It was run by a guy named Phil Suling, and it was in New York City. Mine is not run by a guy named Phil Suling, and it's called the New York Comic Book Convention. It's not meant to be the New York Comic Art Convention. But the Suling one, only 500 people were there. Today, 170,000 people go down to San Diego. The Avengers movies make $1 billion. We walk down the street, look at the apparel people have, the video games that exist, the books that are on people's shelves. Even if you go into a school or a library now, they're comic books. They're books, they're physical books. We won. Those 500 kids won. I'm one of them.
Fair enough. Ron, thank you for your time.
My pleasure, Richard. Completely my pleasure.
I look forward to reading your book, and good luck in your year-long quest to push this book.
Thank you. And a final plug?
Sure.
The first plug is you can find it at a Toronto library if you're watching this in Toronto. If not, please ask your local library to buy a copy, because I want people to read it more than I want to get the little bit of money that I make from it. But if you do want to buy it, check out a comic store. If it's not there, you can get it on Amazon. Thanks very much.
And thank you.